So for this lecture, it's two parts. The first part, we're going to look at just this concept of body composition. We're going to start to familiarize ourselves with body fat percentage. We'll introduce the methods of body measurement, and then we're going to start our conversation on this weight loss versus fat loss. And it's really important. Weight loss might not be the best thing. Fat loss, always good. So this concept of body composition, what does this mean? And before we answer that, let's think of this. People love the scale. And what does the scale, when you step on the scale, what does that tell you? It tells you absolutely nothing. Not at all. Nothing. The reason why it tells you nothing is because all it does is measure force. And you have two individuals here that are roughly somewhere between 180, 190 pounds. Maybe the guy on the right's a little heavier, 200 pounds. But take a moment and think, do you think the guy on the left really looks that well because of a 10-pound difference in weight on the scale? I don't think so. So when we look at this, this really is what kind of reinforces this concept of body composition and looking at the individual percentages of the different tissues and components that make up your mass, your weight. So when you actually step on the scale, what is it actually measuring? Is it measuring water? Is it measuring hair? Is it measuring body tissue? How much you weigh alone tells you nothing of what you're composed of. So that's when we get into this whole how much of you is actually fat, how much of you is actually water, how much of it is actually organs, and most importantly, how much of it is actually muscle. So when we start to look at the different body composition, we can use different divisions of the tissues to determine, or we can look at it any way we want. When you step on the scale, that's a one compartment model. When you separate things all the way out to like an elemental aspect, that's a 6-compartment model. You can see the list of compartments here, and you'll see that number 2 is highlighted there. And that's where we spend most of our conversation, is looking at the separation between fat-free mass, so tissue that's not fat, and fat. So you're looking at how much of your body is actually fat and how much is everything else. The more specific you get into, like when you go from the 1-compartment model, all that takes is a scale. You don't need any specialized equipment for it. For the 2-compartment model, you don't even need that much specialized equipment. You're going to use a caliper or tape measure or something to that effect. As you go further down the chain, it's going to require more invasiveness, more expense, and more technology to get to those compartmental analysis. So this is a visual representation. So the two images on the left here, you see the chemical model, anatomical model. Those are both 5-compartment models. And just because something's a 5-compartment model doesn't mean it's always the same. And in this case, you're looking at different elements. When you look on the right, these are both 2-compartment model, but it has fat separated from fat and essential fat. So just keep in mind that you can look at different ways in these compartmental models. There is this move to look at body composition not from a static structural aspect, but from a functional physiological perspective. Just because someone appears to be overweight or someone has quantitative numbers that makes them look overweight, they might be working just fine metabolically. And the opposite is true. So just because someone appears in a certain way, which is how body composition usually is assessed, doesn't mean that they're functionally moving that direction. When we start this conversation on what body composition is, we always want to make reference. And this average person model divides the body into the fat and fat-free mass. Fat-free mass is sometimes referred to as lean body mass, the LBM, lean body mass. And again, the fat is divided into essential and non-essential or storage. So here's your visual representation of what we make up our body. And just keep note on the top there that for both men and women, the largest percentage of your body weight is your skeletal muscle, your muscle tissue. It is the biggest component of our metabolic demand and the biggest component for our mass and size. You can see that fat takes up a small amount, that essential fat. You'll see that for the female, that it's 3 to 4 times more than men. That's due to reproduction. And also you'll see that men tend to have more muscle, which kind of offsets the body fat percentage in terms of why they have less body fat overall. Bones are usually bigger in men, and then the other down at the bottom represents the organs and other articular type tissues. So you look at these body fat and you see these percentages, and here's your listing of what's considered good and bad, if you will. And you'll see that the standard reference is about 30% for women and about 15% for men, and you can see that women tend to have just more body fat overall. What if I were to tell you you are 20% body fat? And next month you are 18% body fat and then 15% body fat. You could, because of the way I'm telling you, make it sound like that's a good thing, right? 20%, 18%, 15%. But do you have any idea what those numbers mean? What they mean to you? Can you relate to that? Most of your clients will have no idea what 20%, 18%, what any of these numbers may be. That's why the scale is the god to people with weight loss or fat loss, and it's because they're hooked on the scale. Particularly, they're hooked on a number, and it's because they have association with that number to how they looked or how they felt at some point in the past. In their mind, they believe that when they reach that weight, they will return to the state that they remember. And unfortunately, that's not true, right? Because when we look at stepping on the scale and the difference between being fit and fat, there's a spectrum of body types and compositions that would make that number be 200 pounds for a male, or 180, 190, or 110, 115, 120 for a female. But this is where, people think in this one compartment model. We want them to be thinking in this two compartment model. We don't really care if the scale weight goes down. If the scale weight goes down and you're still weak, or you're still soft and you're still flabby, or you can't move, who cares? And sometimes people sacrifice functional tissue like muscle at the expense of trying to get the scale weight down. So that's why this conversation of looking at body fat percentage is really important. And you can see now that the variety of these body types that we see in the fit to fat slide, we can account for that not in their scale weight in the one compartment model, but we get a better estimate based on their body composition. Are we burning fat and maintaining, or in some cases building muscle, which means sometimes you can have no net weight change at all. You lost fat, 2 pounds of fat, and you gained 2 pounds of muscle. Your scale would notice that as absolutely no change, but that's a significant difference in the way you feel and look. So we go away from the cartoons, and I was hoping this image would be a little bit more crisper, but we can kind of look at it here and see the percentages. And just it's important to keep in mind here that when you get to this upper left-hand corner for the men and for the women, this is where you're getting into competitive figure or bodybuilding. And this 3 to 4%, 10 to 12%, this is basically the essential fat. You can't get much lower than this. The thing to remember is that this is an unsustainable body composition. People can get to this point, but they can't stay there for long. And if anyone's ever been around a bodybuilder or a fitness competitor who is getting ready for a show, they are horrible to be around. They're like the epitome of the Snickers commercial, the hangry aspect. They get like this, and they get ready for their show, 12 weeks, 16 weeks up for their photo shoot, whatever it may be. And then once they're done, they're right back to like this 20, 25%. And if you do a quick search on Google for like off-season bodybuilders, you'll see night and day differences. So this is the image that is presented to society and say, oh, we got to be like this. And you get some athletes that can say 6 or 7%. But if someone's going to maintain and still live life and still be healthy, they're probably going to be more in this upper right-hand corner, probably more in this center to the left, 15, 20% for men, 25 to 30% for women. Now, the other end of the spectrum, we start to get here, the sedentary and obese aspect, and anything about over 30%. So this bottom row here and this right and down here is obese. And you can see we have different levels of obesity. You have 30% here, 35, 40. So like mild obesity and like morbid obesity. So there's different aspects, but this is all tied to body composition, so that a 6 foot, 200 pound individual versus a 5 foot, 200 pound individual, you can't do anything with those numbers, and we'll have a slide that represents that a little later. But we want to start getting associated with these body compositions and realizing that the way that this looks, right, that people say, hey, I like that look, this isn't tied to a weight, it's tied to a body composition. So here's the same individual now in their progression from going from off-season to in-season. And I don't know if he's bodybuilding so much, but this was over a period of, I think, 12 weeks. And that's not too bad, right? To go from 30% body fat to 10% body fat. And you can see the visual appearance that happened there. And so if you just try to say, hey, I want to lose 15 pounds, 20 pounds, what people say is that, and they're thinking this is what's going to happen. But if someone does that and they do it in the wrong way, you can actually end up doing more harm than good, because weight loss can compromise lean body mass, which we'll learn later can affect your overall metabolism. It's this relationship between fat mass and fat-free mass that we want to make sure that we're addressing. The fat-free mass, like I said, is the lean body mass, which is composed of all the body's non-fat tissue, and the most important is the muscle. And the one thing you want to look at in section 1 here is that this is the metabolically active tissue. Never, ever, ever, unless it's a tumor, do you want to get rid of that stuff. Never, never. The more you have, the better. It's like saying, I don't want money. Number 1's money, number 2's debt. So you want to get rid of debt, and you want to increase your passive revenue. So the fat-free mass, sometimes it has the acronym FFM, fat mass FM, and then the fat-free mass is sometimes referred to as the lean body mass, or the body mass that is not fat. Fat versus adipose. What is fat, right? We think of fat and, whoa, we don't like fat. We do this fat shaming. I don't even think people realize sometimes what fat is. Fat was demonized in nutrition, and it's like the bad macronutrient. Not anymore, because keto has come in and people are now like at least aware that maybe carbohydrate was the issue. But fat is a macronutrient. Fat's also a tissue, and in the body that's referred to as adipose. And that adipose tissue has the fat appears in 4 areas in the body, and you can see that list right there. And the 2 areas that we're going to be spending the most amount of our time, it's the subcutaneous fat and the visceral fat, and mostly the subcutaneous fat. Visceral fat is a byproduct of lifestyle choices. And when you have accumulation of it, and it's really can't be remedied through exercise alone. It has to be remedied through nutritional and lifestyle factors. But here you can see a cross section of a limb, and you can see that there's layers. So you have the skin on the outside, and then you have right below the skin, you have what's called the subcutaneous. So cutaneous being skin and sub being beneath it. Then you have your muscle layer. Then you have your bone, or if it was in the torso, would be your visceral layer. In this case, it's the bone marrow that's the center fat, the visceral fat. And if it was the trunk or torso, this is where your visceral region would be in terms of the organs. So there's a rumor or a myth that fat turns into muscle and muscle turns into fat, and that is so far from the truth. The number of fat cells and muscle cells that you are born with are roughly the same amount that you die with. Now, no one's ever really proved that, but that's theoretical. But there's no mechanism for muscle cells to replicate up past maturity. There is some mechanism for that because of stem cell activity within fat, but this usually happens in extremely obese people. So when you're 400, 500, 600 pounds plus, your body is in the business now of making new fat cells. But when you lose fat, you don't lose tissue. The cells themselves get smaller. Think of deflating a balloon. Same thing for muscle. When you gain muscle, those cells don't multiply in number. They just get bigger, like inflating a balloon. Just think of fat as like round balloons, and think of muscles as those long balloons that clowns make shapes in. Hopefully you're not scared of clowns. Okay, so when we look at the other aspects of where the fat's at, there's this aspect of intramuscular fat, which is not normal in healthy organisms or population. I use steak there because the one on the right, the heavy marbling, the prime, that is the ideal. But all that fat in between those muscle fibers and fascicles, that's not supposed to be there. That is there in severely sick and severely obese animals with like poor insulin regulation and just almost dead. And if the animal wasn't slaughtered, it would probably die on its own within a year anyways. So the one on the left where you see very low marbling, which is like low grade meat, that's the epitome of healthy organism. So fat shouldn't really be stored in the muscle. But when someone gets really obese, like I said, like 300, 400, 500, 600 pounds, the muscles would look far on the right. Most individuals, like 30% and under body fat, would be on the left. So the other areas fat is stored is around the organs, in the bone marrow. This is where our blood cells are produced. It's a storage site for omega-3, and our brains and spinal cord has a huge amount of our omega-3 and fats. It is required for normal physiological function. And like we saw in one slide, women carry additional sex-specific essential fat around the mammillary glands and the pelvic regions, and this is to support childbearing. So, like I said, the two areas that we're going to look at are the visceral and the subcutaneous. And people tend to think that fat is more storage in nature, and it is an energy reserve, but there's other functional components to fat. Storage is the main aspect, but it doesn't only store excess energy, it stores toxins as well. It's a definitely a role in thermoregulation, and it does offer protection and cushioning for aspect. But the store and the toxins we'll talk more about later in the semester, that sometimes the body will not liberate the amount of fat that it has due to its toxic load. So you might be burning energy, calories, and the body says, hey, we can use that, but it doesn't want to reduce its capacity to store toxins. And so sometimes you need to purge yourself of some of the crap that's in there, heavy metals or environmental pesticides or vitamin A. And once it starts to push out and purge out, the body will start saying, hey, okay, now we can reduce our total capacity and now you look better naked. Okay, so lean body mass is the body mass minus the storage fat, because the essential body fat is considered part of that lean body mass sometimes. It's basically untouchable. It's fat that you can't get rid of. So there's no such thing as 0% body fat. 3 to 4%, like we saw on the slide with the competitive bodybuilder, and it's very rare for women to get into single-digit percentage and still be functional. So those are those lower limits. So about 5% for men and about 15% for women. Less than 5%. You can see for both men and women, it leads to increased illness and injury. You're not going to last long. It's just your body needs that buffer of energy and support. What tends up happening in men is they have a reduced exercise intolerance. Their body, they can't handle stress anymore. So whether it's heat or dehydration or metabolic turnover, same thing with women, but women are sensitive to their menstrual cycles, and when you start to get too much stress or too little, and think of the more fat you have, the more buffer to stress you have. And if you're an athlete or exercising, that's a stress. And so what could happen is it starts to either get like a missed cycles, or you just get a full-on stop of menstruation. All right, so I just want to introduce this, and then we'll discuss this in more detail in our next lecture. But in this particular case, we start to have this debate on muscle versus adipose, so muscle tissue versus adipose tissue, and it gets into that conversation of weight loss versus fat loss. And I've said many times through this lecture that muscle is important and adipose is the sacrificial lamb, and that a fat loss program is acceptable, but a weight loss program that doesn't differentiate between lean body mass or fat is unacceptable. So the reason is that we look at our aesthetics from the density volume. We look at the metabolic activity in terms that muscle tissue is quite a metabolic hog, much more so than adipose tissue. And the good old saying, you can't flex fat, although fat does have some functional aspect, it doesn't nearly do as much as muscle does. So we'll revisit this, and then we have a next lecture here that we look at our starting of our assessments.